kind of cold that shouldn't allow anything to live, least of all, people. In the early 1500s, Moscow was rising. It had survived wars, rebuilt its walls, and slowly started uniting the small Russian states around it. For the first time in centuries, Moscow was becoming the center of a growing country. But even with this rise, Russia was stuck. To the west, strong kingdoms blocked its trade routes. To the south, the Crimean Tatars attacked constantly. And to the north, the seas were frozen for most of the year. Russia had land, but not the kind of land that brought money or safety. It had power, but not enough to stand equal with Europe. The rulers of Russia at the time were called Tsars, basically kings, but with absolute control. And these Tsars wanted one thing above all: a way to make Russia stronger. So they looked east. At first, they didn't know much about what lay beyond the Ural Mountains. Maps were empty. Stories were unreliable. Most people in Moscow imagined a huge, empty wilderness with freezing cold. A lot of explorers never came back. But when Russian explorers finally crossed that unknown land, they realized something surprising. The region wasn't empty at all. Small groups of people were living there. The Yakuts, the Evenks, the Cjbeards, all surviving in a place where winter lasted most of the year. The Russians were shocked, not only because people lived in such extreme cold, but because these lands had something Russia desperately needed, something that could finally bring wealth into the country. And that discovery set the stage for everything that came next. The Tsars could build walls, raise armies, and unite cities. But none of that solved the country's biggest weakness: money. Russia was huge on the map, but in reality, it was poor, cold, and struggling. As almost everyone lived off farming, and farming only worked for a few warm months each year before winter slammed shut like a door. That's it. No major ports, no steady trade, no gold mines. There was nothing that could support a rising Moscow. But across the Urals lived people who had survived in impossible conditions for thousands of years. And they were happy, rich, and healthy. Their homeland was full of animals whose fur was worth more than silver in Europe. Suddenly, this region called Siberia wasn't just the frozen wasteland beyond the mountains. It was an opportunity. But before the Russians could take advantage of it, they had to understand who actually lived there. Because Siberia wasn't empty. Not even close. It was home to dozens of indigenous nations: the Evenks, the Khanty, the Yakuts, the Nenets, the Mansi, and many more, each with their own languages, cultures, and ways of surviving a land where temperatures dropped low enough to freeze a man's breath into crystals. These people didn't just live in the cold, they mastered it. They lived in forests so dense they felt endless, traveled rivers that froze into highways every winter. The animals that roamed these forests: moose, reindeer, sable, fox, ermine, even large predators like brown bear, leopard, and tigers had thick, valuable fur, and they hunted these animals with skills Russians had never seen before. In Siberia, survival meant always staying one step ahead of the weather. And for that, They lived in small, mobile communities, so they can easily migrate depending on the weather condition. Russian explorers were stunned. To them, Siberia looked like a place God forgot. To the people living there, it was home, and they knew every river bend, every hunting trail, every trick to staying alive. But of course, Moscow didn't send men across the mountains just to admire the landscape. They came for fur. Because to the Tsars of Russia, fur wasn't fashion. It was money, power, lifeline for a country on the edge of collapse. European nobles were obsessed with sable fur. It was soft, shiny, incredibly rare, and insanely expensive. One high-quality sable pelt could buy a cow. A bundle of them could buy a house. And Siberia had millions of these animals. So suddenly, every Tsar had the same idea. If Russia could control Siberia, Russia could control the global fur trade. And that one goal, that one obsession, is what pushed Russia deeper and deeper into a land that was never theirs. And it's exactly where the story begins to get darker, harsher, and far more dangerous. Before Russia could take Siberia, it needed a foothold, a base, a point on the map where the Tsar's power could actually touch this new world. That wasn't easy. Siberia wasn't like Europe, where you could just build a town and call it a day. This land fought back, with weather, with distance, and with people who had no reason to trust outsiders. So the Russians did what expanding empires always do. They built a fortress. Although they couldn't build a giant stone castle with towers and banners, as this was Siberia, so they used whatever they could find. It started with a wooden palisade, a wall of sharpened logs driven deep into the frozen ground. Inside, they built long barracks, storage sheds for grain and gunpowder, and a central tower where musketeers could keep watch day and night. It wasn't pretty, but it was a statement. We're here, we're not leaving, and this land now belongs to the Tsar. These fortresses were called ostrogs, and the first ones appeared right after Russian explorers crossed the Ural Mountains. Once an ostrog was built, everything changed. Because suddenly, the Russians had something they never had before. A place to store weapons, a place to hide during attacks, a place to collect taxes, and a place to control the people who lived there. On papers, this fortress was built to protect the indigenous people from the outside world. But in reality, it was built to dominate them. And their way to do that was simple, but brutal. They demanded yasak, a fur tax, not money, not food, fur. Every year, every indigenous man had to bring sable, fox, or ermine pelts to the fortress. If they didn't, the Russians sent armed men to remind them. And this was where things started to get dark. Indigenous hunters had spent generations taking only what they needed. But the Russians? They demanded more. Far more. Sable populations dropped. Winter hunts became longer and more dangerous. Families struggled to survive because every good pelt now belonged to Moscow. And the fortress watched over all of it. Once the base was established, the Russians spread out like roots of a tree. They sent small groups of explorers and Cossacks deeper into Siberia. They mapped rivers, followed animal tracks, and searched for tribes that hadn't yet paid yasak. Every time they found a new group of people, the same cycle repeated. They arrive with gifts, either tea, metal tools, or beads with a friendly face. Demand loyalty to the Tsar. Just sign this oath and everything stays peaceful. Request Yakutsk. Only a few furs this year. Increase the demands. Actually, the Tsar wants more. Build another fortress, and then another, and another. By the 1600s, Siberia was covered in these wooden strongholds like pins on a map, each one spreading Russian influence deeper into the continent. Fortresses became towns, towns became trading posts, and trading posts became the backbone of Russia's fur empire. What started with a wooden wall in a frozen forest turned into a machine of expansion that didn't stop for centuries. If the Ostrog was the symbol of Russian control, then the Cossacks were the ones who enforced it. They were not regular soldiers. They weren't trained in academies or marching in perfect military lines. Cossacks were something else entirely. They were tough, semi-independent warrior communities from the southern steppes, men who grew up riding horses, hunting wolves, and fighting anyone who threatened them. They were fearless, reckless, and brutally effective in places normal armies couldn't survive. So when the Tsar needed men to push deeper into Siberia, into frozen forests, across icy rivers, and through lands where no roads existed, he didn't send noble knights. He sent Cossacks, and Siberia would never be the same. Cossacks expanded Russia, not by building cities or farms, but by doing what they'd always done, moving fast, hitting hard, and never backing down. They traveled in small groups, 20 to 50 men lightly armed with bows, matchlock muskets, and sabers. They used the rivers as highways in summer, and once winter froze, everything solid. The ice became a road. They moved faster than anyone else in Siberia, faster than traders, faster than Russian settlers, even faster than most of the indigenous groups who had lived there for thousands of years. And everywhere the Cossacks went, they carried one message: pay Yakutsk, or we will come back. The Cossacks' way of negotiation wasn't gentle. If a tribe agreed to pay the fur tax, the Cossacks left them mostly alone. They took hostages sometimes, usually sons of the local chiefs, just to make sure the oath was kept. But if a tribe refused, that's when things turned violent. The Cossacks raided winter camps, burned storage huts, destroyed canoes, stole reindeer herds, anything to break resistance. Some tribes fought back fiercely. Others fled deeper into the forest. But resisting rarely worked, because the Cossacks always returned, with more men, of course, as they had a whole army backing them. Year after year, they pushed further east, collecting more furs, building more outposts, and planting the Tsar's flag in lands no European had ever seen. In Russian stories, the Cossacks became heroes, brave adventurers discovering new lands. But to the indigenous peoples of Siberia, they were something very different. A force that brought violence, disease, and endless demands. To some, the Cossacks were like a winter storm, unstoppable, merciless, and always coming back. And yet, the Cossacks themselves weren't living easy lives either. They slept outdoors in temperatures that could kill a man in minutes, followed frozen rivers into territories no map had recorded, fought animals, hunger, and isolation long before they fought other people. Every step east was a gamble with death. Still, they kept going. Because the rewards, gold, silver, weapons, land, and even personal land grants from the Tsar, were too tempting to ignore. The more territory they claimed, the richer Moscow became, and the more powerful the Cossacks themselves became. However, once the Tsar's men reached the great rivers of the east, the Lena, the Yenisei, the Amur, they understood something important. Controlling Siberia wasn't just about crossing rivers or reaching the Pacific. The indigenous people were very resilient. As long as they have land left, they'll always survive, no matter how extreme the odds are. If Russia wanted to keep this land, control its furs, and rule the people who lived here, it must need permanent strongholds in the harshest parts of this frozen land. Places that could survive winters colder than anything Europe had ever known. And one of those strongholds would become something unimaginable. A land where the average temperature in winter was negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit. A city that shouldn't exist, but somehow it does. Yakutsk. In 1632, a Cossack leader named Pyotr Beketov was sent deep into the territory of the Yakut people. The region was so hostile that even seasoned explorers hesitated to go there. Beketov's orders were simple: claim the land, collect yasak, and build a strong base for the Tsar. So he and his men waited for summer, then traveled up the Lena River, following the safest path that froze into a solid highway each winter. Still, the winds were sharp enough to draw blood. Nights fell to temperatures that could kill a man in minutes. Pyotr Beketov lost a lot of strong men on his way. And yet, when they reached a bend in the river, a place the Yakut tribes knew well, Beketov made his decision. Here, right here, in this land of ice and silence, he would build the next Russian fortress, an ostrog. It started the same way they always did. Summer helped, but only a little. Even in the warm months, the ground beneath their boots was frozen so hard it could shatter iron. Hammering palisades straight into it was almost impossible. So they turned to a native technique. First, they built a bonfire over the spot where a post needed to go. They let it burn for hours, feeding it with driftwood and cut branches until the frozen earth beneath began to sweat and soften. Only then did the men shovel aside the ashes and dig into the briefly thawed soil, working fast before the ground froze again. Inside came the barracks, the watchtower, and the storerooms. Nothing fancy, nothing comfortable, just enough to survive. But this fort was different, as when the ground refroze in autumn, it locked the post in place like stone. This gave palisades incredible stability. Basically, nature's concrete. Winters here ended in seasons, and the ground was frozen all year. Even the locals had spent thousands of years learning how to endure the cold. And somehow, that tiny wooden fortress survived. Across the first brutal winter, across the second. And before long, people began gathering around it. Traders, soldiers, hunters, families. A settlement grew. Then a community. Then something far larger than anyone imagined. What began as Beketov's frozen outpost would slowly transform into the heart of Russia's Far Eastern Empire. The fort became a trading hub. Administrators and clerks followed the soldiers. Small workshops, stores, and supply caches sprouted outside the palisade. For the Yakut people, the change was immediate and complex. Some clans resisted, some fled upriver to avoid raids, and many others accepted their fate and adapted, trading furs for metal goods and horses, selling food, working as guides or laborers. The yasak system repeated. Cossack pressure forced many Yakuts into regular tribute and seasonal work for the fort. Disease, violence, and disruption reduced their communities. But Yakut social structures and language persisted. They didn't vanish. Today, Siberia is a vast province of Russia, and Yakutsk is a bustling city in one of the coldest places on Earth. Modern streets hum with cars and people, markets thrive, and schools operate despite the extreme cold. Though when temperatures drop to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, students are sent home. Engines must run 24/7 to prevent freezing, and foreigners also live here, adding to the city's diverse culture. Yet, the memory of those first wooden forts and the courage of the Yakut and Cossacks lingers. Even in a land that seems impossible, life finds a way to bloom. Yakutsk stands as proof that even the harshest cold cannot crush the spirit of those who call it home. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe our channel, The Curious Corner, for more fascinating content.